In a never-ending obsession to get new listeners, we often forget one of the most important ways we get new listeners. Welcome to the More Profitable Podcast with Stacey Harris. I'm Stacey, and this is the spot to learn more about the strategies, tactics, and tools you need to build your more profitable podcast. My team and I work every day with podcasters like you to shift shows from frustrating time sucks to productive members of your sales team, because your show should be built to generate and convert leads. So let's get into it. Welcome. Episode 601 of the More Profitable Podcast is here. I'm super stoked. We're going to talk about gaining new listeners today by stopping thinking about your new listeners. One of the biggest misconceptions in podcasting is that a show is all about growing the audience. And yes, a component has to be about growing the audience, just in the same way that a component of your business always has to be about generating new leads, because you need to have a new pool to convert from. You need to be seeing growth. There's going to be a certain amount of fall off that happens. People evolve in their life, things change. And so we have to be growing to not replace those people, but to make sure that that leads pool stays full and our business stays healthy. More important now than ever. And oftentimes, I hear from podcasters who are spending so much time thinking about how to better market their show, how to better grow their listenership, that they're forgetting a really, really important piece. And that is your current listenership and the role they play in growing your show, because they do really play a role in the growth of your show. And honestly, I'm probably going to hit this drum more than once. I'm going to be honest. If you can't convert the listeners you have, then doing the things you've been doing to grow your show is attracting the wrong kind of listeners. And that's something you're going to need to address. Because if you're building a show that is created and strategically built to generate, educate, and convert right fit clients, that means it's got to be working on that conversion side. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm really stoked. Before we dig into that, I do want to remind you, if you missed it this month, because it just happened this week, it's actually happening the very same day the show releases. We're going to be doing another podcast roundtable next month, and we would love to have you. To be honest, I haven't actually done it yet, so I don't know how it went, but I'm sure it was great. And I would love to have you next month over at Podcasting for Profitability. You can find the link, reserve your seat, uncommonlymore.com/roundtable. Make sure you join us. We're going to be talking about monetization next month. We'll be talking a little bit about monetizing in the ways we all know and converting clients into services. We're going to be talking about some fun ways that I'm going to be playing with monetization this summer. You're actually going to see that rolling out soon. And I might talk about it over in the podcast newsroom a bit. Honestly, if you haven't joined us in the podcast newsroom, you can do that now at podcastnewsroom.com. I want to keep this one brief, so we're going to jump right in. There is two ways that focusing your attention, focusing your strategy and your time on taking care of your current listeners will support you in growing your listenership. One of them is very technical and full of allure and hard to measure. And the other is easier to see and is the easiest for you to control. Let's dig into the first super vague one first. There is no real clarity around how the search algorithm in podcast players works. However, in the podcast space, there is generally a pretty good consensus that consumption time plays a part. Certainly in those early days of getting on like new and noteworthy and stuff like that. But anytime hitting the charts, showing up in where you show up in search, part of that platform is acting as a search engine. And one of the believed components of that search engine, one of the things that search engine is potentially factoring in, is your consumption time. And so you want to make sure that you're building episodes that are created to stay the whole way. You want to make sure you're creating episodes that keep you engaged. And this is why we talk a lot about, and you're at some point going to be sick of me hearing about this, and I'm still going to be talking about it because it's so important. But that's why we talk so much about the next job. What is the next step that needs to happen after a point? And so as an example, let's sort of walk through a podcast episode. The title of a podcast episode buys us a click, not a listen, a click. The intro is going to buy us a little more of a listen. And as you move through an episode, you really are buying just a little more attention. We can use an episode of this show as an example for this. We start with a hook. We've got our pre-recorded intro. And then when we come back from that pre-recorded intro, there's usually a little bit of a tease for what's to come, paired with a call to action. Now, that call to action is not usually, I'm not going to say never, because then somebody will email me and be like, this one time, and I don't want to do that. But almost always is something free. So in this episode, we talked about the podcast roundtable that we have coming up in May and June. We talked a little bit about the podcast newsroom because it made sense in the context of what I was saying to you, but it was free stuff. It was stuff where there's not going to be a paid component. It doesn't take a huge amount of trust for that to be a yes, right? Now we're getting into the meat and potatoes, as it were. So we've transitioned into our first of what for me is usually 3 parts. Today we're going to talk about this in 2 parts. And this is just me buying you into this part. And this first bit buys you into the second bit. And before we know it, we're at our wrap up and our final call to action, which is almost always a paid call to action. So come work with us on production. We've got open podcast strategy intensive spots, whatever that is at the time. Honestly, those are the 2 things that we charge for. And so it's most often one of those 2 things. When we do that though, I have invested in that ask throughout the show. I didn't make that ask at the beginning, because up until that point, I was only trying to buy enough attention to get you to keep listening. The show has to be built to keep people engaged. And that's going to happen, yes, in your length, but also in your structure. So be mindful that you're moving people through something. We actually talked a little bit about this in a podcast newsroom audit. It was the building a sales asset for your sales calls with Diane Wingert. It's like 3 or 4 episodes ago in the feed. So if you haven't subscribed to that yet, go to the podcastnewsroom.com and that will give you access to it, and check out that episode with Diane. But we talk about exactly this because at the time when we did that audit, she has shifted this now. But when we did that audit, Diane had a mid-roll in the middle of the episode. And we talked a little bit about why that was disruptive and where a mid-roll can work and where a mid-roll shouldn't, will sort of work against us. So to extend this conversation, go listen to that episode because we talk a lot about this there. But the idea that you're just moving people through to the next portion of the episode till you get to the end, and then you're moving them to some next step with you, some piece of real estate with you. Again, for us, that's that paid offer, that paid promo piece that's at the end of the show. But the job is really to move them through the episode. And that's because we want to see people make it to the end of the episode. We want to see people that invested. Think of it like this. Your lead is essentially getting warmer and warmer and warmer the further and further and further they make it into a podcast episode. Your trust is building as each minute ticks by. And the belief in the podcast community is that in addition to building that trust, as you see higher and higher completion rates, your show is weighted more and more heavily in the search results in the podcast players. Again, none of that is public information. These are assumptions we're making off of the data we see. So, there's some ways you can see roughly what your audience completion is. If you go to your platform specific podcast stats, like the Apple Podcast stats or the Spotify for Podcasters stats area, you can see some of those completion rates. I will say I find that information to be lacking wildly. This is yet another area where podcast stats are not where we would like to see them, and I think they are not where they will ultimately be. I'm currently testing some third-party stats tools to see if we can get a better read on this completion rate. And I don't want it to be something like anything, like any part of your stats. I don't want it to be something that you get hung up on, and I don't want it to be something that you are living and dying by. But as you make decisions, be factoring that in. And if you're seeing that those completion rates, or if you're seeing that you're hearing in conversation and it's kind of becoming obvious that people are not making it all the way to the end of the show, that's something you need to address. And there's a couple of ways to address it, and we'll talk about that. But honestly, this is why there's that little joke at the end of this show where I talk about, well, if you made it here, do you know how often that's mentioned to me? This is how I know people listen to the whole show. Because regularly it comes up in the course of client conversations. Regularly it will come up in sales calls. People in podcast audits, we've talked about it. Like, this comes up a lot because the show is built to keep buying you in as we move through the episode. Also, this isn't about just buying in. It's being aware of how much time you've bought. When I started this episode, I told you this one was going to be a quick and dirty one. You know why? Because there's only so long that you want to hear about this. We're talking about something uber specific today. We're talking about something uber boring. And we're talking about something that's not particularly sexy to fix. That's just the facts. That's just the brass tacks of it all, right? And so that means I need to be mindful of how much effort it's going to take me to keep buying you in, and for how long that runway is going to last. Think about it this way. When I am talking about stuff that's super fun or super sexy, or I know is going to be easy to move you through to the end. An example of that being last week's 600th episode. Most people are going to listen to that whole episode. A, it's just a banger's good time. And B, the people who specifically tune into a 600th episode are people who give a crap about the show, right? You care. You're bought in a larger way. And so I have some leeway. When I have interviews, when we do case studies, I buy a little more of your attention because there's two voices here. There's someone besides me to listen to, and that's super engaging. It's one of the reasons interview shows do well, is because two voices is super engaging. It's also why interview shows can be longer, because it's more engaging to be listening to multiple voices, multiple perspectives. However, when I'm doing things like this, where it's just the chopping wood and carrying water of building a podcast that supports your business goals, it's the boring minutia of building sales assets. I'm only going to buy so much time because there's only so much fun this is going to be. So I'm mindful of my episode lengths in totality as well. And so, yes, this is the super technical side of this. This is how in the search algorithms and in the course of like how our show is ranked and yes, there is a lot of value in getting someone to listen to the whole show because long term, it's going to help you show up. But there's a second way that paying attention to how your clients or how your listeners rather are consuming your show now is going to impact your show growth. If I can't get you to listen to me for 20 minutes, I'm not going to get you to share me with a friend. I'm not going to get you to take action and then see a result and then share that result with a friend. I'm not going to get you to book a conversation with me. I'm not going to get you to pay me, hire me. And so I'm not going to get the referral. I'm like, there is a human component to this. And so often when we forget that human component, we end up no better than like, do you remember cell phone companies and like cable companies in the early 2000s, maybe even the 10s? Honest to goodness, probably started in the 90s, where it seemed like every other day there was an ad and a super sweet promo, new customers only. That's it. New customers only. Because the only thing these companies care about is adding new users, not retaining the users they have. I think this is a colossal business mistake. I think this is something we have seen flood the online service-based business space. It's honest to goodness, I'm really attempting to be as light on the dramatization as I can be here, but it is an absolute epidemic because there is this belief, especially in the last 10 years. I think we're seeing shifts now, but especially for the last 10 years, where it doesn't matter how I treat you as a customer because I've got 10 more coming in through Facebook ads on the front end. I don't need to worry about what's happening at the bottom of the funnel because my top of the funnel is stocked. The internet's different now. Business is different now. The way you attract clients is now. Paid advertising is different now. Organic advertising and content conversions are different now. And if you're building a business that is reliant on fresh blood, and there's no nicer way to put that, you're going to struggle to survive. And you're making your business a lot harder than it needs to be. And that really does start here. Because when I spend so much of my energy, so much of my money, so much of my capacity attracting new listeners, I am falling down on the job of converting the listeners I have. And oh, by the way, if I can't convert the listeners I have now, I don't actually need new listeners. I may need different listeners, which is the closest I'll need to new listeners. But if I keep doing the marketing tactics and the ad spend and the whatever that I'm doing to get new listeners currently, and I'm still not converting that listenership, then I'm attracting the wrong listener. I want that to really sink in. If you cannot convert the audience you have now, if you are not seeing a result with the show you have now, and you're doing the things we talk about on this show, you need to address the show problem, the content problem. It is not a listenership problem. More often than not, when a client signs with us and we're talking to them about their goals and we're having the conversation about what they want to see, this is happening in our initial contact, this is happening in our sales conversation, and they tell me they want to grow their show. My question is, great, how's your show doing now? How many of your sales can you point to your podcast? How many of your leads can you point to your podcast? And if the answer to that question is I'm not currently getting leads or sales for my podcast, then you don't have an audience size problem. You have some other problem. A conversion problem, an audience fit problem, a content misalignment problem, whatever it is. The problem is not the number of listeners. And if you keep focusing on building in new listeners, you will continue to struggle to see results with your show, no matter how big that show gets. And that is just shoveling a lot of effort into something that's not going to pay off. And that's asking for a lot, especially as we move through this world in 2023 and all of our capacity feels smaller than ever. If it feels hard right now, you need to look at, how do I make it easier? You need to look at, what are the shifts I need to make in my show to start seeing better results? And if you don't know what those shifts are, then it's time for us to have a conversation. This is a great way to use a podcast strategy intensive. If you're somebody who's like, yes, I know this is what I want, then let's talk about production. But it's time for you to get some support so that you can start building a show where you do see these results, where you start getting support in building these assets week after week. When you start getting support in structuring your show in a way that gets results, so that when you focus that time on building new audience, you're driving new listeners into a machine you know works, into a tool that you know is built to support them through their process as they get educated on what is needed from them, as they get educated on why you're the right solution for them, and they go, oh, yeah, cool, let's fix this. That's what it means to build a show that generates, educates, and converts right fit clients. Not just leads, but right fit clients. Okay. With that, we have episode 601 in the books. I hope it was helpful. I want to hear from you on this one. So reach out, DMs, email, whatever mode of communication. Let me know your thoughts here. Again, everything you need for podcast production, podcast strategy intensives, whichever feels like the right fit for you, is over at uncommonlymore.com. I cannot wait to sit down and talk to you. I will see you right back here next week. Thanks so much for listening to the show. Remember that content consumption does not make changes. So commit to doing something from today's episode. Maybe it's taking action on what we talked about. Maybe it's reaching out to me and learning more about podcast strategy intensives or what podcast production looks like with our team. All of that is over at uncommonlymore.com. And if you haven't yet signed up for the podcast newsroom, I want to remind you that is a great next step. If you're not really sure what comes next, hang out over there. Get those exclusive private episodes. That's over at podcastnewsroom.com. And the last favor I will ask, because social proof is endlessly important for sure, is to leave a rating or review for the show. If you go to ratethispodcast.com/more, that's the easiest way to do it. But I would love to hear what you thought of the show, what you think of the show, and if the show has been helpful for you. I can't wait to chat with you. So this is just the start of the conversation. Reach out so we can keep it going. Talk soon.